started. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's iteration of the European Security Initiative Speaker Series. For more than 5 decades, nuclear weapons, dialogue on nuclear weapons and arms control has been a key part of the U.S.-Soviet and since 1991 the U.S.-Russian relationship. And among other things, it's produced a host of acronyms, SALT, ABM, INF, START, New START, SORT. And it's produced some agreements and has been useful not just for arms control, but arguably it has also had an impact both for good and sometimes for bad on the broader U.S.-Soviet and U.S.-Russia relationships. So I'm delighted we have Amy Wolf with us today to discuss both the history and what the future might hold in U.S.-Russian arms control. Her title is Specialist in Nuclear Weapons Policy at the Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress for more than 30 years, and she is the go-to person when somebody in the Senate or a member of the House of Representatives wants to know something about the arcane points of nuclear weapons or arms control. And that's bipartisan analysis to both sides. And I would say that few people in Washington know much about the history of arms control as Amy, who can tell you, as she told me this morning, that there are now 380 days until the New START treaty expires, which is not your typical factoid for somebody to have at the top of their list. So we're delighted to have her there. Actually, she's coming back here. She's a graduate of Stanford University. And Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, that's loud. I'd like to thank Steve and CZAC for inviting me here today. This is a true honor. I discovered arms control many years ago in a lecture hall here on campus, and I'm really happy to be back. My first goal today is to look back over the 50-year history that Steve mentioned, just U.S.-Soviet or U.S.-Russian nuclear bilateral arms control. That's the scope. To identify some of the truths or truisms that we've come to believe about those 50 years, and to break them down to see if they provide us with any insights or guidance into what we might expect in the future. Second, I'm going to look to the future and raise 3 questions about how the future of U.S.-Russian arms control might unfold. These questions are, when does the future begin? What role will arms control play in the future? And what is arms control? I'm not going to answer a 4th question, which is probably the one you really want the answer to, which is, will the United States and Russia extend New START before it expires? Yeah, 380 days from now. This is partially because my track record when it comes to taking bets on specific arms control events is really bad. I always get it wrong, so maybe you actually do want me to take a bet. But also because I am here as an analyst at the Congressional Research Service, and Congress would not ask a CRS analyst to make such a prediction. However, if you ask, I might offer some insights into the factors that I see that would affect this prediction, even though I won't reach a conclusion for you. So first, turning to the past of arms control. In a speech last April, Deb Fischer, who is the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, spoke at a conference in Washington and noted, and I quote, "When I refer to arms control, I mean treaty-based reductions in nuclear arms, which is what I believe most people today think of when they hear that phrase arms control," end quote. She's right. That's what most people think of when they hear arms control. But is it true that U.S. and Russian or U.S. and Soviet arms control can be characterized as treaty-based reductions in nuclear arms? There are 2 parts to that, treaty-based and reductions. So let's look first at treaty-based, if I can make this work. Okay, how does this work? There we go, no. Just page down? Or is...
The right arrow might do it.
No, and there's something. Hang on, let's get rid of this. There we go, okay. These are the U.S., Soviet, U.S., Russian bilateral nuclear arms control agreements between 1972 and 2010. There are 9 items in this history, 7 treaties, 1 executive agreement, and 1 example of unilateral declarations that occurred without any prior agreement or coordination. 2 of the treaties never entered into force. This leaves 6 formal treaties or agreements over 50 years. One of these, the Moscow Treaty, did not impose any discrete or definable limits on US and Russian forces. 2 are treaties the United States has withdrawn from, and 2 have expired. That leaves 1 remaining treaty. That's a pretty thin record. Yet looking back, we still feel like arms control was an ever-present feature of the US-Soviet relationship, at least during the last 25 years of the Cold War. The arms control process and formal negotiations often represented one of the few channels for communication during that time. The ongoing process provided a sense of progress. Even Congress focused on the process. Obviously, the Senate held hearings when it had a treaty to consider for ratification, but at least during the Cold War, both the House and the Senate often held hearings on the substance of the negotiations, even when there wasn't a completed treaty. Senior government officials often briefed members so they could stay informed about the US goals and progress in achieving those goals. The process mattered. The negotiating process continued after the Cold War. The George H.W. Bush administration negotiated START II in 1992 and signed it in 1993. The Clinton administration negotiated 2 agreements related to the 1972 ABM Treaty, a protocol extending START II, and it outlined a framework for a START III treaty. None of these entered into force, but the process continued. The process continued in 2001, but the value placed on concluding formal treaties diminished. During a summit meeting with President Putin in November 2001, President Bush announced the United States would reduce its nuclear forces, but he said we would do so unilaterally, without signing a formal agreement with Russia, and he offered to write it down on a piece of paper, and that's a quote, write it down on a piece of paper, but he indicated that he believed a handshake would be good enough. Pentagon officials also argued against signing a legally binding agreement because they wanted the United States to retain the flexibility to adjust its nuclear forces based on the national security environment. So when the United States did write it down on a piece of paper, and that became the Moscow Treaty, Russia signed on to force levels that the United States had already decided it was willing to go to. Later in the decade, the United States and Russia held discussions on missile defense cooperation and on possible transparency measures to compensate for the end of the original START treaty, but it had no interest in legally binding agreements. New START, signed during the Obama administration, has also stood out as a single episode of arms control, in spite of the president's view that it would be the first step on a path to deeper reductions. One can blame this on Russia, particularly after 2014, but parts of the US political establishment and some in the Senate also would have not looked favorably on a treaty mandating deeper reductions. While I'm on the subject of domestic politics, I'd like to touch on 2 common truisms about arms control. One asserts that it's easier for a Republican president to conclude arms control treaties than it is for a Democratic president, and the other asserts that arms control has generally received bipartisan support. This chart shows who signed what and what the votes were in the Senate, if there were votes, and on the surface this looks true. The votes all look strongly bipartisan, and with the exception of the New START treaty, all the treaties that entered into force were signed by Republicans. In fact, there are only 2 nuclear arms control treaties signed after World War II that were signed by Democratic presidents: the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty and New START. But I think this chart actually tells a different story. Arms control is actually quite partisan. Democrats generally support arms control. Republicans generally do not. But Republican senators generally support their president. So Republican presidents who pursue arms control can get high votes on their treaties, and you see those votes here. Democratic presidents can have trouble even getting hearings on their treaties. That's the history of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, long and tortured history. New START is the exception, but the Senate had 60 Democrats in 2010. You need 67 to get consent for ratification of a treaty. Getting 60 to start is a really good start. The vote took place during a lame duck session when several Republicans who were not returning the following year felt free to vote for the treaty, even in spite of the party's animosity towards the president. And several other Republicans were reportedly promised funding for the nuclear facilities in their districts in an effort to encourage them to vote for the treaty. So my first observation, the 50-year history of arms control is more about process than product. It's a history of 30 years of discussions, communications, and explanations of nuclear weapons programs, policies, and force levels, followed by 20 years of sporadic discussions, but disengagement from the view that this type of process can and should play a role in reducing nuclear weapons and reducing the risk of nuclear war. And it's no less partisan than any other issue we face today. Second question, has arms control focused on reductions? It's absolutely true that the numbers of US and Soviet or Russian nuclear weapons have declined sharply during the 50 years of arms control. But there's an obvious chicken and egg problem here. Did arms control lead to the reductions in nuclear weapons? Or did a desire or willingness to reduce nuclear weapons lead to arms control? And if it's the latter, what led to the willingness to reduce nuclear weapons? I could walk through the treaties. The 1972 ABM Treaty limited the numbers of ABM sites and interceptors, but it was achieved after both sides had already recognized the high cost and limited technical effectiveness of their ABM systems. The companion interim agreement on offensive arms capped the number of missile launchers, but did not limit the number of warheads those launchers could carry. And both sides began to introduce multiple warhead missiles into their force, and they saw that as the future of their forces, and the force levels expanded. The 2002 Moscow Treaty simply ratified the plans the United States had already decided it was going to follow, and Russian forces were already declining to those levels due to financial pressures. Even New START's reductions were modest and didn't require many unplanned reductions in US delivery systems. And they were consistent with the force structure requirements determined in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, because they advised, the Nuclear Posture Review advised the negotiations. INF and START, the Reagan-era treaties, are a bit different. They did mandate significant changes in existing force levels. But when the United States first introduced the negotiating positions in 1982, they were widely viewed to be non-negotiable. They were somewhat intended to be non-negotiable. They became acceptable after 1986 because the political environment had changed. Both Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev wanted to show bold progress in reversing the arms race. Reagan for his reasons of his legacy, Gorbachev for economic reasons. And therefore they had the political will to affect the arms control process. So my second observation, while arms control may have helped manage the nuclear competition, it ratified rather than required reductions in nuclear weapons. Arms control has not changed the world, but changes in the world have been captured by arms control. So let's turn to the future. First, when does the future begin? And that may seem like a silly question, but it's important to determine when the future of arms control begins, because the date you choose can affect your assessment of what might happen in the future. Much of the public discussion and many of the meetings I've been sitting through for the last year start the clock on the future of arms control somewhere between October 20th, 2018, when the President announced that the United States would withdraw from the INF Treaty, and February 5th, 2021, when New START will expire. These dates generate a discussion that focuses on how the United States and Russia can recover some of the benefits of a ban on intermediate-range missiles in Europe, whether they should extend New START to retain its benefits on predictability and transparency, and whether China should be brought into the New START and arms control process. Use that date, that's the discussion you have. So it leads to fairly narrow discussions about formal treaties and numerical limits, even if we adopt the administration's framework and call it 21st century arms control. One could also select a date around the beginning of 2014 to the middle of 2014, when the US State Department first publicly accused Russia of violating the INF Treaty and when Russia annexed Crimea. This time frame supports the view that the problem for arms control is not the absence of specific treaties, but the absence of a credible partner. In this view, Russia cannot be trusted to abide by its obligations, and the United States should not accept any limits on its nuclear capabilities until Russia changes its geopolitical behavior. You can hear this argument in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, when it states, and I quote, "Progress in arms control is not an end in and of itself. and depends on the security environment and the participation of willing partners. You can also find lists in the Nuclear Posture Review and elsewhere in administration documents of all the 7 or 9 or 17 or whatever number they're using treaties that Russia has violated. That is the view that gives rise to a future that says we can't pursue arms control with Russia at this point in time. A third possible date for the beginning of the future would be February 5th, 2011, when New START entered into force. As I mentioned before, President Obama considered New START to be a first step, to be followed by more treaties and deeper reductions. He actually proposed deeper reductions in 2013. But Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, put a damper on these expectations in an interview in January 2011. He suggested that further steps would have to include other nuclear-armed nations, and, I quote, "The agenda must include weapons in space, strategic missiles equipped with conventional explosives, and other weapons." He repeated Russia's particular concern with U.S. ballistic missile defenses. The items on this list are things that the United States would specifically want excluded from a future arms control agreement. We will not pursue negotiations that include limits on missile defenses or space. Moreover, Russia has rejected the U.S. list of what should be included. First, Russia's non-strategic or shorter-range nuclear weapons systems, and second, more recently, Russia's new exotic types of strategic systems. And while the United States would like to expand arms control to include China, Russian officials have sought to add France and the United Kingdom. Thus, the U.S. and Russian arms control agendas not only diverge, but specifically includes seemingly irreconcilable demands. So if 2011 is the year when the future begins, one might imagine that it could take a major dose of political will among political leaders to overcome this obstacle. Second, what role do we see for the future of arms control? And given that this is an academic and not a congressional setting, I'm about to get really wonky, sorry. It seems like a simple question. For some, arms control should reduce the numbers of nuclear weapons on a path to their elimination. But as I just noted, this really isn't how we used arms control over the past 50 years. Instead, we would argue that we have used arms control to negotiate limits and restrictions on weapons and activities, to reduce the risk of misunderstandings that might lead to a crisis, to reduce the instabilities that might cause crises to lead to conflicts, and to reduce the damage if conflicts do occur. In short, we use arms control to strengthen U.S. national security and mitigate nuclear dangers. But even here, there are different views about what types of limits and restrictions allow arms control to serve this goal. One approach focuses on the characteristics of weapons and the instabilities that arise due to the interaction amongst these weapons. This view advised the arms control negotiations in the 1970s, the SALT I and SALT II treaties, when we thought that expansive ballistic missile defenses would undermine stability by blunting each nation's ability to retaliate after a first strike, and would cause both nations to expand their offensive forces to overcome the defenses. So the ABM Treaty imposed limits on missile defenses. We can also see this in the 1980s and early 1990s, in the START I and START II era, when large land-based multiple warhead missiles were the culprit in stability calculations, because they were lucrative, vulnerable targets that might invite a first strike, leading a nation to assume it had to launch first in a crisis to avoid the use or lose conundrum. And START II would have banned them. But there's another view that looks less at the interaction between the two nations' weapons and more at the capabilities and characteristics of each nation's weapons individually. In this view, large, fixed, land-based missiles, particularly those with multiple warheads, are destabilizing, not because they are vulnerable to first strike, but because they are effective weapons for a first strike. And they might be used to coerce an adversary to back down in a crisis. That's one reason why the United States focused so much of its arms control effort and attention in the 1970s and 80s on Soviet heavy ICBMs, and offered arms control proposals that would limit those weapons with little effect on areas of U.S. advantage like bombers and submarine-launched weapons. These differing definitions of stability are evident today in discussions about the future of New START, which is why I just took a wonky walk down history. Russia is developing a number of new types of delivery vehicles that, according to President Putin, are designed to penetrate U.S. ballistic missile defenses. We withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002, and at the time, the Russians believed we were about to start deploying expansive missile defenses. We weren't, we aren't, we don't, but they thought we might, so they started developing weapons that would allow them to retain their assured second strike capability. If you see the exotic systems through this prism, they fit into the first model of stability and should not pose a threat to the extension of New START because they don't introduce a new threat to the United States. We don't have missile defenses. Russia's missiles can already assure a second strike, so there's nothing new in these. But some analysts have argued that they do pose a new threat and must be included in New START. They are a threat because we can't defend against them. They are terrifying in their effects, and we don't have anything like them. That doesn't sound much like a stability argument, unless you add, so Russia might threaten to use them to coerce us to capitulate. And that's the argument you hear. Moreover, not only are there different views about how arms control can contribute to U.S. national security, there are some who don't even believe it can contribute at all. They see restrictions on U.S. nuclear forces as a burden on U.S. sovereignty and flexibility, and arms control as a gift we give to other countries. Even if they don't state this explicitly, although some, like John Bolton, have written about it extensively, and they do state this explicitly, they'll argue that arms control may be an acceptable tool of U.S. diplomacy, but only after we've resolved our national security challenges. This is a common view among many in the current administration. They're willing to pursue arms control, but only after we're sure we're secure. Third, returning to a point I raised earlier, what is arms control? As Senator Fisher stated, most people think it's treaty-based reductions in nuclear arms. But as Schelling and Halpern noted in their iconic study nearly 60 years ago, quote, we have also considered arms control to include the less formal, less institutionalized, less negotiated understandings and agreements. This broader definition is quite evident in the 50-year history of U.S.-Soviet arms control. The two nations set up crisis management agreements, they negotiated missile launch notification regimes, they established rules of the road that would mitigate the risk of crisis, they issued declarations about the effect of nuclear war and the meaning of strategic stability, they shared information about their nuclear forces, they shared visits to military bases and held military-to-military consultations to build confidence and increase transparency, even when they weren't tied to specific limits and restrictions in treaties. The future of arms control can include these types of measures and procedures as well, even if it does not include formal treaties that limit or reduce nuclear weapons. And these may be just the types of measures that we need to include if our goal is to bring China into the process. So this broader definition is evident in many of the proposals for a near-term future that might not include an extended New START treaty. These include suggestions that the United States and Russia offer political commitments of unilateral but mutual restraint on the deployment of new kinds of missiles, that they reiterate political statements about the futility of fighting a nuclear war, that they engage in cooperative transparency measures in the absence of New START's monitoring regime, that they pursue strategic stability, or these days we're calling them strategic security talks, where the two countries, or three if you include China, can continue discussions about their doctrines, forces, and plans for the future. Each of these suggestions faces headwinds in the current political environment, and I'd be happy to discuss them in more detail if you're interested. Nevertheless, these types of measures may provide a bridge until a time when the political environment changes and we can return to treaties. To wrap up, if the future of arms control, at least the near-term future, does not include formal legally binding treaties that limit or reduce nuclear weapons, it will not be just because there is not enough time before New START expires to complete a new treaty that covers all the weapons and all the countries that make up the administration's concept of 21st century arms control. It will not be just because Russia has shown itself to be a poor partner for arms control with its violation of INF and its malign behavior in Europe. It will also be because the two countries have embraced sharply different agendas for the future of the treaty, and China has not embraced either agenda. And the three nations may not be able to summon the political will to bridge those differences as long as the political leaders in one or all of the countries believe that restraining their own weapons in exchange for restraints on the other nation's weapons do not serve their national security interests. As a result, in the future, proponents of arms control may need to identify a broader list of measures beyond formal treaties to manage nuclear dangers and reduce the risk of nuclear war. And maybe we should stop calling it arms control so that we can recognize progress even when we don't sign legally binding treaties that limit or reduce nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. Let's go ahead and open up the floor to questions. And, oh, and if I could ask you,
Yeah,
identify
tell me who you
yourself
are.
and your affiliation, please.
Yeah, my name is Lauren Borja. I'm a standing nuclear security postdoc here at CSAC. And I was wondering, so one thing you've talked about a lot is transparency and how that's kind of an unwritten goal in a lot of these. And when I think of transparency today, I think of kind of private satellites that are allowing other partners to come into these debates. Could you speak how that is possibly working into arms control, either hurting or, I don't know, probably not helping, but yeah.
So yeah, I know it's a big deal with private companies doing open source intelligence. I don't pay a lot of attention to that because I know who to talk to when I need to know. And I know all the folks down in Monterey. There is a sense that the information gathered by groups like Bellingcat and the Monterey folks is very, very useful in keeping countries honest and making it difficult for them to hide things that happen. But that's different than the concept of transparency and the arms control arrangements that we have with the Soviet Union and Russia. These treaties establish data exchange, data information systems that the two parties have to participate in that provides data that's not available to satellites. The way I think about it, satellites, even our national technical means, our own intelligence satellites, take snapshots when they fly over of things that are limited by the treaties. Even the on-site inspections are essentially a snapshot. We're here today to confirm the data that you've given us before. The transparency that really counts for being different in the US-Russian arms control relationship is the constant set of data exchanges. The notifications every time something moves, the data exchanges about the capabilities and characteristics of weapons, those provide a moving picture of what's going on in each country's force structures. In the absence of formal treaties, you lose that moving picture. Whether you're doing it with your own intelligence satellites or with open source satellites, every other picture you take is just a snapshot. And in the absence of these moving pictures, you lose confidence in your assessments of what the other country is doing. Snapshots, no matter how many of them you take, can't make up for that.
Does it also give you, like, is there more agreement on what that data means and the interpretation of the data when it's provided through these channels? Not necessarily.
When the United States and Russia sign treaties, they agree what data they're going to exchange. And they're very, very specific. It's not just tell us what you're doing on Tuesday. The treaties have databases that you fill in the blank. So everybody knows what the data is. And even with that, you get compliance disagreements. So they have a body in the treaty, whether it's the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the Joint Verification Commission, where you sit down and talk in case you have discrepancies in the data or misunderstandings about the data. But open source intelligence providing new sources of data could actually confuse that process because it doesn't provide data to the detailed specification of what you asked for. So if someone walked in and said, Bellingcat said you did this, first, you'd never see that in the SCC, and or the BCC. And second, it adds another layer of room for misperception. So in the US-Russian arms control process, you'd rather not open it to the outside sources because they don't meet the definitions of what it is you're supposed to be providing data on.
Let me follow up on that question with, I guess, sort of, when you look at the cooperative measures that you have to do, start the data exchanges, the notifications and such, if those go away, I mean, over the last 50 years, the argument has been made because America has a more open society, you know, those are more valuable to the United States than to the Russians. But also, my impression is that because we have the Russians handing us information, it reduces the pressure on the intelligence community on intelligence assets to devote things like satellites to tracking this. How much understanding is there in Congress that if in fact New START goes away and we lose that, and although it's interesting, you mentioned the possibility of new cooperative measures on transparency. Sometimes when the subject has come into discussion with the Russians that I've had, the Russians say, legally, we can't do that. You have to have a treaty or we can't start sharing with you what in fact is classified information in Russia. But is there an understanding in Congress that once this goes away, we lose a lot of information about the Russians and or have to spend more to build up the intelligence capabilities to make up for that?
First, as I said when I mentioned this on the list, there are headwinds. That's the headwind to this, that the Russians cannot exchange data or provide openness in the absence of formal legally binding treaty. And oh, by the way, in some cases we can't either. Some of the data we provide through treaties is considered formally restricted data, so we can't just throw it on the table. When you say, is there knowledge in Congress? There are 535 members of Congress. Most members of Congress don't pay any attention to this. So the question is not, is there knowledge in Congress? There are several members of Congress who are quite aware of this problem, and there have been proposals for amendments in legislation to ask for studies from the intelligence community. I think Senator Merkley proposed legislation. I'm not sure if it made it in the NDAA. I should know that, but I don't. That have asked the intelligence community to provide a report on how much it would cost or how they would replace the information lost through New START. But I can tell you, even without an intelligence committee report, they can't replace the information lost in New START. One could say, oh, well, they can spend, how much would it cost to buy all the satellites that they would need to make up for the loss of the data exchanges? All the satellites in the world wouldn't be able to provide the moving picture that the data exchanges do. The data exchanges are a constant flow of information. So even if you took pictures 3 times as often, with the expense of the additional satellites, which the intelligence community will tell you they don't want to spend the money on, or they might, I don't know what they would say, that's why Congress has asked for reports. But no matter how many discrete photographs you take, you don't get the constant coverage that you get in the data exchanges. So the loss of the intelligence from the shared information, I said the on-site inspections also provide snapshots, and therefore they're not as useful as the data exchanges. But the on-site inspections provide something different. Even though you're there to confirm that the data provided in the data exchange is accurate at that base that day, you gather other things like, what's the paint job look like on the TEL? Does it look like they're taking care of these weapons? How are these things deployed? Does it look like they're, keeping track of where things are? You get a sense, and the intelligence community can see things that, or the inspectors, I don't know about the intelligence community, the inspectors know what they're supposed to be seeing at the bases. So if something looks out of place, they can recognize it. They're there for the specific goal of confirming the data exchanges, but you're not blind to what's going on around you. So in the absence of the treaty, no amount of overhead intelligence is going to give you that sense that something's different here from the last time I was here. And therefore, even though Congress is aware and is asking about the costs of replacing the data, the underlying argument is there's nothing you can do in the intelligence community to replace some of this on-the-ground, hands-on data exchange.
Okay. Certainly.
Hello, I'm Larry Brandt, currently an affiliate here at CSAC, formerly from Sandia Laboratories. You seem to have at least guarded optimism about the future in this broader arms control formulation that you've introduced. You've identified Russia and China as potential beneficiaries with the U.S. in these transparency and other types of agreements. Have you ever thought about extending this concept into the North Korean arena, or is that a bridge too far from your perspective?
It is, but not for the reason you ask. I'm going to do something classically CRSism here. I don't cover North Korea. We have analysts who do, but it's not me. So I'm sure they would have great insights into the role of transparency in North Korea, but I don't. My goal when I get questions of this nature is to, tell people what I know in sitting in meetings. And I haven't been paying attention to the North Korea stuff, sorry. So I'm going to punt on a CRSism.
Could you give us an update on the status of the joint committee that, to which the U.S. and Russia are supposed to report new developments that affect strategic nuclear weapons?
You mean the BCC, the Bilateral Consultative Commission under New START?
And have the Russians, what have they said before this committee about their new weapons?
Okay. The Bilateral Consultative Commission established by the treaty is where they get together to discuss compliance issues and other implementation issues. It meets twice a year. We are now in January, so it will meet this March and then next fall, and that will be it if the treaty expires. Its goal is to address the systems that are currently covered by the treaty. And what you're asking is something that several members of Congress have asked. If under New START, Article 5, Paragraph 3, oh God, I shouldn't pull that off the top of my head, something like that. It says, if a new kind of strategic offensive system appears, the country not developing that system, but the other country can ask the country developing that system to explain it in the BCC. So Russia is under no obligation when it develops new kinds of systems, not a new ballistic missile that already meets the treaty definition, but new kinds of systems. Russia is under no obligation to wander into the BCC and say, oh, by the way, we have a new system. If we see it, we get to ask them about it, and they get to decide how much they tell us about it. So senior members of this administration were asked twice in congressional hearings whether we've had that conversation with Russia about some of these new exotic systems. The first time the answer was no, and the second time the answer was yes. I'm not sure how much substance is behind the yes, because in the absence of having deployed any new system, we don't yet have the right to ask. The systems are all, the SARMAT, which will count, or the new heavy ICBM, and the Avangard, the hypersonic glide vehicle, which will count, those have already been discussed. They're counting under the treaty, they've already been discussed. So the ones that people are asking about are the long-range nuclear-powered cruise missile, the underwater nuclear-powered drone, and there's a third one. The hypersonic air-launched ballistic missile doesn't count under the treaty. But the thing is, those things are still in development, maybe in PowerPoint slides and not real.
One blew up.
But basically, yeah, it's not a really deployed, it's not even close to being accountable under the treaty, even if it were. So we are not yet in a position where we can ask about it because it doesn't meet the treaty's definition of a new kind of strategic system. It's not at that point of development. And the Russians are not obligated to respond. So yet on those specific systems. So when senior administration officials said no to the first one and yes to the second, the time they were asked, I don't know if that yes was about these more exotic systems or the ones that are actually reaching deployment. And other than that, I don't have any insights because they don't tell me. But I do know that the treaty limits what we can ask about, doesn't require the Russians to tell us unless we ask. And then you have to wait till the weapon reaches deployment.
David.
Yeah, David Holloway here at CSEC. So I wanted to ask you about the kind of alternative approach that you laid out to arms control, dealing with maybe unilateral or reciprocal commitments, cooperative transparency, strategic stability or security talks, and so on. And how much is there in the history of arms control that could be carried over of that kind of agreement, like prevention of nuclear war agreement? Are there principles and guidelines one could find in the non-arms control reduction treaties to build on in a future relationship, or is that kind of hopeless task?
No, I think that's where I would look for evidence of things you might try just to keep the conversation going while you're waiting for the environment to change. But even that is proving incredibly difficult. We had strategic security talks with the Russians last week. And if you see the readouts, and we had a discussion about this amongst several of us, I see it, the Russian readout is saying, you guys are still putting your talking points on the table. We don't know what you want to talk about. And our readout says, we have all these things we want to talk about with the Russians and they're non-responsive. So we're still at that kind of phase where it could be useful, but in the current political environment, it's not yet. The unilateral but reciprocal measures is a reference to President Putin's proposal for, in the absence of INF, we should just declare we're not going to deploy intermediate range missiles in Europe. And first he presented it to us and we went, no. And then he presented it to the allies in an effort to peel them off and they went, no. The problem is they've already deployed a missile that we consider to be intermediate range, and until they address that, we're going nowhere there. And oh, by the way, this administration thinks it might want to deploy intermediate range missiles, so we'd never agree to the moratorium. So there are lots of examples where these things have worked in the past, and if I ever write the paper that comes out of all of this stuff that you've now heard twice, it will talk about what some of these headwinds are. But one of the ones that people seem to think is obvious that we should do is to redeclare the Reagan Gorbachev statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Yeah, can't even get that one out of this administration because there are people who believe not global nuclear war between the United States and Russia, but in certain circumstances, the United States might find the use or the threatened use of a nuclear weapon to be part of its war planning. And if that's true, then they don't want to make a political statement saying you can't, it makes no sense to do that because they're planning to do that. Now, I don't know the details of any of that, but I've heard that you can't even shake that kind of statement loose. So yeah, I think it provides plenty of opportunity. The history provides opportunities for the future, but the headwinds right now are kind of too heavy.
Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Pétari. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the CGSR at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My question is about the allies. You have mentioned to me just this morning that you have traveled to Europe many times last year. So I was wondering, what's your take on the role of allies? Is there anything that allies could do short of a US engagement with Russia or a US engagement with China? Can anything happen in Europe or in the Asia Pacific that comes from the allies? Because we have seen that there is interest in Europe to continue the arms control procedures, sporadic ideas about risk reduction measures, the Swedish stepping stone initiative, and a bunch of other things are on the table. So there is interest. Is there anything they can do to help this process, or anything they can achieve on their own with the adversaries of the US? How do you see that?
If you're talking specifically about New START, probably not, because it really is a bilateral treaty, and expressing their opinions about a treaty that does not engage Europe in either the deployment of the weapons or the ownership of the weapons is a hard sell to the people in the national security environment in the United States to say you should listen to the allies on something that really has nothing to do with them. They had some input, obviously, we all know the history, into the INF decision, but even there, we brought them along to finally agree to say what we've been saying all along. Their initial approach, their long-standing views didn't change the US position. The US position changed their views. Right now, the one place where they seem to be playing a slightly more influential role is in open skies, that when the Allies found out the United States was planning to possibly withdraw, they spoke out, they demarched, and they seem to have affected the pace and maybe the direction of the process. But that's because they're parties to the treaty. We may be a little bit more, the people in the current policymaking community who get to make these decisions may be a little bit more amenable to the Allies' views because they are parties to the treaty. But on New START, short of issuing press releases and commenting on the treaty, they really have no role to play.
Back there.
This is a very useful conversation in the context of conventional arms control. But how would you prioritize this, considering that the world is moving, and particularly Russia is moving strategy towards unconventional hybrid warfare? Is this still, how useful would it be? Would it still be the top priority of conversation? And the second question, if you allow, is how is this convergent with the fact that both the US as well as NATO centralized leadership seems to be pushing for increased defense spending from the allies, and they are also behind building the European defense force that is specifically, which would mean more arms.
Gonna CRS punt again, but for two different reasons. First, on all the other domains that we are worried about arms competition and interested in looking at some forms of restraint, I agree that is definitely the direction where the discussions are going. And I sit through many meetings in many rooms where those discussions are going on, and I don't understand them. I mean, a lot of the technologies are beyond, it's just not in my portfolio for what I pay attention to regularly. So in my sporadic attendance at these meetings, I sit there and politely nod along. I understand from the nature of the conversations that this entanglement issue, that emerging capabilities other than hypersonic glide vehicles, which actually are in my portfolio, the rest of these technologies, I understand they could be extraordinarily disruptive and more important to the escalation or crisis management problems than nuclear weapons. But I don't understand the rest of the conversation. Yeah, well, in a lot of the meetings I go to, not all of them, but in a lot of them, but I get invited everywhere. So I'm not sure really of the nature. There are a lot of people thinking about it, writing about it. There's a lot of grant money going into it. There's a lot of attention being paid. And I've decided it's too difficult for me to figure out. On the question of what's going on with the allies and defense spending and European Defense Initiative issues, this is something that is definitely not nuclear in terms of what the debate is between the United States and the allies, but has a nuclear component because if it's not managed, and this is something that really kind of worries me, if it's not managed correctly at the conventional level, then you're more likely to see crises escalate and problems. And so you're seeing problems in the alliance that could end up being nuclear problems. And I was particularly concerned with the 2018 nuclear posture review because it asked a nuclear question and answered with a nuclear answer and divided that from the conventional balance and conventional issues in Europe. And I found that concerning, not because you wouldn't expect a nuclear posture review to do that, but because we've been moving in the last 5, 6, 7 years to think about deterrence in Europe and defense issues in Europe across a broader spectrum. And I was concerned that that broader spectrum was not getting the attention in the nuclear posture review. It's gotten attention in other documents and other administration policies, but from where I sat, we seem to be compartmentalizing again in a way that we hadn't before. And I would find that worrisome if it were in my portfolio to worry about those sorts of things, but it's not.
Scotland.
Scott Sagan, professor of political science and senior fellow here. One of the forms of arms control that was often under the radar, at least in terms of public awareness and maybe even congressional focus, at least during the Cold War period, was operational arms control. The incidents at sea agreements, dangerous military activities agreements, various kinds of notification of tests and exercises, etc. Can you talk about the status of either those existing agreements and practices now, and whether there is interest, even if some of these formal mechanisms end, to have more operational arms control, even with states other than Russia?
I think you're accurate in that Congress is not aware that most of them exist, but from what I understand, most of them are still operating just fine. The nuclear risk reduction centers where we do the data exchanges and the notifications that are required by these agreements, they're all operating as normal. That we continue to have crisis management and data exchanges with the Russians. And yet we still see incidents where the Russians are buzzing our ships and things like that. So the community of people who are not in Congress but who worry about this see gaps in these systems, in these agreements, and opportunities for procedures, crisis management issues, further agreements, cooperation that would reduce the risk that these things would get out of hand. But we're facing a second, this is also something that's facing headwinds. The headwinds here are that cooperation with Russia is not particularly popular right now in Congress.
Maybe it's a good thing that's below the radar screen.
Yeah,
It hasn't
so,
become politicized.
yeah, well, no, it hasn't, but there's legislation that says you can't have cooperation at some levels. I mean, we've seen the drop off, the fall off, the elimination of the threat reduction programs. And there are some who are acting so skittish about this that they're cutting down communication channels as well and saying, well, if we can't cooperate, we can't communicate. That's not actually true, but there's far less communication now than there was during the Cold War. And there are members of Congress who recognize that this is a problem and would like to see some reversal of that, even if they have to put it in legislation. But there's great fear of opening that can of worms and reminding people that we should be communicating and in some cases cooperating to reduce the risk and to increase crisis management capabilities. So the community at large recognizes this as an area for progress, but the headwinds there are pretty strong too.
I'm Len Weiss. I'm a CSAC affiliate. I retired from the Senate about 20 years ago, actually. Amazed myself by saying that. But
I was already there.
When I was there, I was one of the larger generators as well as consumers of CRS reports. And I'm curious about how CRS operates these days. For example, it used to be, when I was there, that CRS could generate its own studies without necessarily having a congressional sponsor, and then search for a sponsor after they produce the report so that it's all done on the up and up. Some administrations were really did not like that, and at least I don't know how it is now, but there was a move to try to restrict CRS's activities to only those things that were specifically asked for by congressional committees. What is the situation now?
You're asking me to criticize my management on the record. Great. No, actually, that's not true, and it's never been true. We can do anticipatory studies. We've always been able to do anticipatory studies. There's a line, used to be a line on our calendars if it was not requested by a congressional office that this is anticipatory. You didn't have to go find a sponsor. If you were taking a huge amount of time and a huge amount of resources, it benefited you greatly to be able to tell management that a member of Congress requested it. But in my 30-odd years there, I've probably done about a half a dozen studies that are anticipatory, including this Future of Arms Control study. What makes it difficult is not policy, but time and resources. Recently, we've been growing again, but for many, many years, CRS has been shrinking, and we're about one person deep on many issues, particularly in the national security side. And if you took your time to do a think piece type of study, first it would take longer than you anticipated because you'd have to put it aside every time a member wanted a memo or a shorter report or something hit in the news and you had to cover it, or you had to write testimony and go testify about the Open Skies Treaty. The day-to-day job gets in the way of writing an anticipatory study. So this one is like 10 or 11 months into process, and the only way I'm getting it written is by writing pieces and going and speaking about it. So we can do that, but we don't have a lot of time and resources to do it frequently. Management would prefer, I can't speak for management, but I don't think they object as long as you can find a rationale why Congress needs to know about this. So I can't go write about Japanese tea gardens. That would not pass muster. But if it's within my portfolio and I think I'm providing a service to Congress, I can do that.
So if I could just follow up with one question. So for example, everybody understands there's a connection between non-proliferation and arms control. I'm curious, since you couldn't answer a question about North Korea earlier, to what extent is there cooperation among the different sectors within CRS so that the Congress can receive an understanding of what these kinds of connections are? Because normally you don't hear a lot about those connections between non-proliferation and arms control, except if you read, certain scholarly magazines and so forth. How does CRS deal with that when you need to have people from different parts of CRS come together in order to produce a comprehensive study of a connection of that sort?
if you want to focus just on nonproliferation and arms control, there's only 3 of us, and we wander in and out of each other's office all the time. We co-author things all the time. I have one report that's been in my portfolio since 1991. It's what I call the Arms Control Catalog, and the 3 of us are listed as authors on it, and we each write different sections of it. There's no problem cooperating because it's just the 3 of us. Earlier this month, I walked into one of the regional analysts' offices and said, what's your schedule look like in March? We need to cooperate and write a report. So at that level, at least in our division, because there are several CRS divisions and they all operate differently, and I have no idea how the other divisions do it. In our division, most of the time, cooperation across sections and between the functional people and the regional people is just a matter of knocking on the door. If a request comes in that requires cooperation, it's split between the analysts and they write the memo together, or each writes sections. It's not a problem. It's human-to-human cooperation. But there are times where something may be more complicated, may require more people, more time, and the people involved don't necessarily have the time, so it gets a little bit difficult to carve out the time. But a really good example, 1 or 2 days, it could have been 1 day after the start of the current kerfuffle with Iran, with the attack on Soleimani, a CRS report came out, frequently asked questions about what's going on right now in Iran, 1 or 2 days after. There may have been 8 or 10 co-authors on it. Now, if you look carefully through it, you can see it was not co-authored in that everybody chopped on everybody's lines. It was different sections, but they were answering questions across a range of issues. So you go to the expert who would be writing on that issue anyway, and they all threw their sections into it and it got pulled together. In an emergency, it happens. When it requires more time over a longer period of time and everybody, we're only 1 deep in issues and people are like, oh, I don't really have time now, it can be a little more complicated. But on some issues, like I said, we walk in and out of each other's offices and finish each other's sentences.
Buck?
I'm Devak Das. I'm a MacArthur pre-doctoral nuclear security fellow here. So my question is related to deterrence. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about, is there a broader understanding of deterrence that underpins these processes? By which I mean, do changes in what to deter and how to deter produce each of these outcomes? And the reason I ask is it possible then, depending on what your answer there is, of course, if we cannot determine right now what exactly we are trying to deter and how to deter it, how do we reach an arms control agreement in the first place?
I'm laughing because I'm teaching a class at Georgetown this semester on exactly that question. Some of these treaties look like there is a concept for deterrence behind them, and you're trying to balance that concept for deterrence. The ABM Treaty was a classic example of that. But of course, I also told you that the ABM Treaty was possible because neither side really wanted to build ABMs. So the deterrence model created the framework for the treaty, which would have been irrelevant if there hadn't been political will or economic will to do it. So there's an analytic side and a political side. All the analytics in the world won't get you an arms control agreement in the absence of political will, but you can get arms control agreements in the absence of analytics. The Moscow Treaty has no deterrence model behind it. This is what we're planning to do, sign up or don't, we don't care. So in the class I'm teaching, I'm actually taking the students through that process. Here's your deterrence model, here's your strategic stability model, and we're going to look at case studies, some treaties that do reflect on the models and some that do not. And I don't want people who were deeply involved in the process of negotiating New START to get mad at me, but New START does not fit the deterrence model. New START is a modest reductions in nuclear weapons, and modest reductions may or may not fit a deterrence model, but that wasn't the reason. I mean, you can slap a deterrence model on it and say, oh, it works, but that was not, like the ABM Treaty, the driving force behind it. So there is a lot of arms control that is about the outcome, not about the input, and a lot of arms control that has analytic input and manages to get outcome anyway. That better not get me in trouble with certain people who we all know who I'm talking about.
I'm just going to give you an amusing example of where there was treaty. It was negotiated in a year, and it had neither any political aspects to it or technical. And yet it was considered an arms control treaty. And that's the Enmont Treaty.
Oh, yeah, environmental modification, yeah.
And I was much involved in it, that's why I'm so familiar with it. Neither side, it was bilateral, neither side, I think it was open for others to join. I think they have other signatories now. Neither side had a plan or any program to use environmental modification for weapons purposes, mass destruction purposes. And there was no technical programs going on, and there was no political emphasis. And yet the Russians brought it to us. We cleared it immediately through all the agencies of the government. No one was thinking about it or cared about it or even knew what it involved. And the whole thing got negotiated and signed immediately.
There's actually a whole series of treaties, not a whole series, but several treaties that are just like, almost just like that. They're the non-deployment treaties, whether it's Antarctica, sea-based, putting weapons of mass destruction on the moon or other celestial bodies. We agreed not to do things we didn't want to do anyway, just to make sure nobody got any ideas to do it.
Well,
and
that's
it
why
looked,
the Russians brought it up.
yeah. There's a whole, and they're called the non-deployment agreements, and they were very fashionable in the 60s when there was no other pathway to an arms control. We were just trying this on for size. And I often point this out to people when they start talking about arms control in different domains, like cyber arms control or space. It's like nuclear arms control didn't jump up fully clothed as formal treaties limiting nuclear weapons. We went through this whole process and procedure where we agreed not to do things we didn't want to do, or not to do things that we probably wouldn't want to do, or not to do things that we wanted to do but were too expensive. So we walked into it slowly. We didn't jump up fully clothed. And in all these other domains that people keep saying we should do arms control here, my first answer is most of these domains are not amenable to arms control, but at least start crawling before you run, because even in the nuclear world, that's how we did it. And these non-deployment agreements were a big part of that in the early 60s. I agree, yeah.
Question back in the back there. Yeah.
Follow question here, Susa. You did say that the problem was not in the absence of treaties, but the partners don't trust each other. So
I said the problem was not just in the absence of treaties. I said if you picked a particular date, you saw a different problem.
So looking back at the 50 years of arms control, what was the time when the two sides were in the best shape in terms of trust, in terms of being trusted partners? And if there was such a time, what are the elements that went into it, and what happened that unraveled this?
Yasmin asked me this yesterday. 1986 to 1991, the INF and START era, the second Reagan administration. And it was because both Reagan and Gorbachev saw political goals that could be met by having arms control agreements. And so, people here know far more about the details of Reykjavik than I do, but the Reykjavik summit at the time that it happened came off looking like a failure, because we came this close to eliminating nuclear weapons and we didn't do it because of SDI. And I have distinct memories of George Shultz's press conference after the summit failed and the dire look on his face. Yet today, Reykjavik is considered a success because it launched this era that then produced the INF Treaty, that then produced START, and that finally in September of 1991 produced the presidential nuclear initiatives. What was happening is the world was changing really quickly and arms control was playing catch up. Reagan and Gorbachev decided to accept the United States non-negotiable negotiating positions going into INF, a 0-0 treaty with lots of on-site inspections. As a matter of fact, when he finally said yes, we went, whoa, now we have to do this. Of course, there are people here who know more about that than me too. So, but it was an opening for rapid progress because the political will was there and the geopolitical situation allowed for it. And it ended, I go through September of 1991 with the PNIs, but it actually went on a little bit further. We signed START 2, but it never entered into force, that there was this sense that the world was changing, we were overburdened with nuclear weapons, and we could start cleaning out the attic and the basement really quickly. How do we get back there? I have no idea.
Yeah, if you don't mind me asking a follow-up question, but could you talk more about the clash between Russian and American military doctrines and strategies and how that influences political will in the administration?
Probably not. I'm trying to think of what I would know to say about Russian and American military doctrines.
I mean, the common answer people say is it's a clash between Russian military assured destruction and American military assured stability. Is that, or mutually assured stability? Is that a fair characterization or too simplistic?
I think that was it was frequently argued over the last 20 years that the United States wasn't a fan of formal negotiated arms control agreements, so we didn't have to maintain a deterrent with Russia because, as the Bush administration said after the Nuclear Posture Review in 2001, Russia's not our enemy anymore. We shouldn't just deploy nuclear weapons that are smaller size of what we had against the Soviet Union. And I'm paraphrasing that but that's pretty close to the direct quote. That the United States was ready to move on. We don't need to deter Russia. Our nuclear weapons aren't about them. And the Russians going, hey, wait, no, our nuclear weapons are about you and yours should be about us. You should worry about us. And we were saying, we don't worry about you. Well, now we worry about them again. So I'm not sure whether the framing of this that the Bush administration was trying, and the Obama administration, and before it, even the Clinton administration, was trying to adopt that we needed to move to a less antagonistic and more cooperative relationship. Yeah, I'm thinking that's gone now.
Hi, Jonah Buchanterman. I'm an honors student here. I'm wondering what your take is on prospects for the new State Department initiative. I think it's called Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, and how you imagine the review conference for the NPT might play out in a few months.
Okay, Anna asked about that already today, and I don't do nonproliferation, so I'm not going to make any predictions on the NPT review conference. From what I hear, and this goes to, do I talk to the people who do nonproliferation? From what I hear, it's not going to be pretty, but maybe it will. Yeah, there are a lot of issues on the table and a lot of disagreements. Now, the good news is Chris Ford has a lot of experience in the nonproliferation review conference process, and the U.S. This is one area where the State Department actually is staffed with people with some experience in this. Of course, it's not all positive experience. So SEND is an interesting idea. It evoked a lot of cynicism when it first came out that, oh, Chris's idea is instead of using nonproliferation and disarmament to fix the world, let's fix the world first, and then we'll be ready to do nonproliferation and disarmament. What I have heard from participants in the process, and I don't talk to a lot of them, but I have talked to a few, is that that level of cynicism is probably not warranted, that there is something there for the nations participating in the process who are not nuclear weapon states. For them, the issue isn't nuclear disarmament. The issue is other kinds of security and stability issues. And to the extent that the State Department has put together a process to recognize and try and resolve these issues, even unrelated from the NPT review conference, is a good and productive pathway for participation. Whether it reaches outcomes, I don't know. I haven't asked them. But if you link it directly to the NPT review process, you tend to get the cynicism. And if you see it as a broader global security initiative, you get less cynicism.
I want to ask a question, shifting to nuclear weapons, which is in your title. Yeah. The Obama administration laid out its plan for recapitalization of the strategic triad, which was basically endorsed by the Trump administration with a couple of add-ons. But it seems like every year, the estimates for the costs go up. And above and beyond the delivery systems, the new submarines, the new bombers, and the new ICBMs, there's the cost of the warheads. And there was an article I just
Yeah,
saw
I saw it.
that said basically the National Nuclear Security Administration asked for X amount of money for warhead programs, and it was substantially cut back. And there's apparently now a disagreement within DOE on that, but NNSA basically said if we don't do this, bad things are going to happen with regards to our ability to do the life expectancy programs on warheads. So if you look at the strategic modernization program out to the next 10 to 15 years, is the money going to be there to do that?
This has been a problem and a concern of the modernization program since October of 2011, when the Budget Control Act passed Congress. And what the Budget Control Act did is it took $1 trillion out of the defense budget over 10 years. And that runs out in 2021. Now, every year since the Budget Control Act passed, Congress has waived it, basically, and added more money to the defense budget. But if you talk to your defense budgeteers, either at CRS or Todd Harrison at CSIS, there's this widespread agreement that defense budget growth cannot be sustained at the rate we've been doing over the last 2 to 3 years, even across the whole defense budget. And the argument from the people supporting full funding for the nuclear modernization programs is we can afford survival. One of them said that to me. And that nuclear weapons are affordable because they'll only be 6 or 7% of the defense budget. And I think—
stop you right there? That is, I think—
I'm about to say, I think that's the wrong question. I think it's the wrong answer.
I was going to say it's a bogus argument.
I know, I get that, I get that.
Right.
So the reason it's the wrong question and the wrong answer is because it's not about how much it costs, it's about trade-offs and opportunity costs within the defense budget. And I have this conversation with people all the time. And the debate about whether it's enough money or too much money is not about how much they're costing, but how much they're worth. If you ask people who think we're spending too much money on nuclear weapons, whether they'd be willing to buy them if they cost half as much, they say no. And you say, well, what about if they were free? And having asked some of them this, the answer is there are some of these weapons I wouldn't even want to buy if they were free. So it's not about how much they cost, it's about how much they're worth. That's true for those who want to buy more. If you ask them, well, would you want to buy them if they cost twice as much? Yes, of course, we can afford survival. They cost 3 times as much, and I have yet to get to the point where they say, no, that's too much. But so it's not about how much they cost. There's opportunity costs, there's trade-offs, and it's about how much the weapons are valued. So you have this debate in Washington, and you don't reach closure because it's actually not about money. Now, this article this morning on NNSA is really interesting because there's a couple of things going on there, and I'm not there, so I don't know what's going on. But it appears the United States has been throwing money, a lot of money, at NNSA is in the Department of Energy. They own the warheads and the nuclear weapons complex, the labs. There is widespread agreement that these things have been undercapitalized since the end of the Cold War. In the first year of the Obama administration, the vice president, whose name was Biden, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal outlining why the Obama administration was going to sharply increase funding at NNSA, which they did. They promised more funding as a part of the New START ratification. They continued to raise funding. I'm sure since you saw Kingston's stuff this morning, there's a chart that shows this. It's in one of my reports too. And then you get the report this morning that NNSA is asking for something like a 20% increase next year. And the sense is that this is not just about pursuing the ongoing programs, that there's another agenda behind it. Now, Lisa Gordon-Haggerty's response in the article this morning talked about her heartburn letter. Heartburn letters are an interesting beast. They're the letter that a head of an agency writes to explain why they can't take their budget cut, and they're all way over the top. When the Budget Control Act passed in 2011, the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, wrote a heartburn letter about the Budget Control Act and the cuts to the defense budget and said, basically, if this goes through, we're going to have to eliminate the ICBM force, which we haven't done. So obviously it did go through and we didn't have to do that. So they tend to be a bit over the top, but they're trying to make a point. And the problem for NNSA is not that there was a heartburn letter that looks like all heartburn letters, but that there's a number of ongoing programs that are going to accelerate and explode in cost over the next few years. And one can be almost certain that the cost estimates are seriously underestimating them because A, that's always true, and B, NNSA has a horrible record of estimating the cost of its capital construction programs. So there really almost certainly is a pinch coming, there's a cliff coming in funding for the programs. And GAO does a study every year or every couple of years on NNSA's planned spending and always points out that they're under budgeting, because NNSA puts together a 25-year budget plan, that they're always under budgeting for the programs that they want. And what it looks like in this request and in Lisa Gordon-Haggerty's response is it's even worse than expected. And if the defense budget does not continue to grow, and this is of course not in the defense budget, this is in the energy and water appropriations bill, it's in, well actually, it's in the defense authorization bill, but it's NNSA's budget, but it is a national security function. So if it continues to grow at the rates that she's requesting for the next year or two, that it's unsustainable. And if she's then arguing that the entire nuclear deterrent funding will fall apart, that's extreme. But there are some specific programs in her portfolio that may be both pushing the rise in costs and most vulnerable to the cuts in budget. And if she won't specify what those are, I'd be concerned. But also, I'd really like to know that they have contingency plans for if and when this crisis comes. And I'm not, I just don't have knowledge about whether they do or not. But yeah, the article is pretty ugly.
David?
You mentioned in your talk you wouldn't give a prediction about New START extension, but you would talk about the factors which would be involved in determining the outcome. So maybe I could ask you to talk about those.
An hour or
You've
two.
mentioned some of them.
Yeah, okay. There are a number of competing pressures on whether or not New START will be extended. The most obvious one is the personnel as policy problem. And for the last year or two, we've known that the personnel responsible for bringing the decision to the president were opposed to New START extension. Some of them are no longer with the administration, but there are still personnel within the administration who do not believe that arms control serves U.S. national security interests. I mentioned that as a school of thought. There are some who believe arms control, and New START in particular, play a significant role in U.S. national security, and most of them are in the uniformed military right now. The former head of STRATCOM, General Hyten, I think the current head of STRATCOM, although I haven't heard him speak about it very much, General Dunford, when he was chair of the Joint Chiefs, General Miley hasn't spoken about it very much. But the sense that the predictability and the transparency that you get from New START is of great interest to U.S. national security. But if you go back over the last 2 or 3 years and you follow their public statements, caveats begin slipping in the last year or so about concerns about Russia's exotic systems. Some of which I mentioned will count under New START, and the ones that won't count under New START don't even come into the force until after New START would expire in 2026, but it's still being used as a caveat, which gives me concern because if it's not a current problem, why are you using it as a caveat unless you've been fed the talking point and it is now the formal position of this administration that we should not extend unless we get Russia talking about it. So those are some indicators about why there's probably support for extending it, but it may not be extended. On the other hand, there are some other indicators going the other way. There was an op-ed in Politico recently offering an idea for how we might leverage New START extension to get Russia to bring these other weapons into the discussions. And it's not the first time that at least one of the authors had mentioned we should extend it, but only if Russia agrees to discuss these things. So the leveraging was we extend New START on the condition that Russia opens negotiations with us about these new types of weapons, and with the threat that if these negotiations aren't taken seriously, we will withdraw from New START. I don't think that people would be offering contingency plans if there weren't some possibility that they might be in a position to argue that these should be implemented. If the decision were just flat out, no, we're not going to extend, why are you offering a contingency plan? There's also the fact that Russia had a condition for extension that we address their concerns about our compliance with the elimination rules. And Putin, right before the end of the year, said, unconditional, let's just do it. So that takes away, if we're trying to leverage and hold out on New START extension to get them to drop their conditions, they've dropped their conditions. So again, it takes away some of the pressure to not extend. So I don't know how it will come out. I had a different view about a month or 6 weeks ago than I do. Then I probably would have, on a scale of 1 to 10, been in a slightly different place than I am now. So I don't know how it'll come out, but the indicators are, you know, you got the military on one side and the civilians on the other. You've got the military adding caveats, but the civilians offering contingencies. So I don't know. Does that help?
Okay. Hey, Len, last question.
As the loudest voice within NNSA regarding these issues, what role are the lab directors playing here?
I haven't heard much from the lab directors on New START extension, or, well, they obviously every year have to write their letters certifying the stockpile. They played a very active role in New START ratification. They testified, they were asked to write letters, they were organized into being a combined force. I have not seen any combined effort on their part to weigh in one way or another on the future of arms control. Right now, I mean, one reason, and this is going to sound cynical, but one reason that they may have been willing to weigh in so much on New START is there was this linkage between funding for the modernization programs and ratification of the treaty. Right now, they are quite flush with funding to the point that they may not even have the capacity to absorb some of it, and therefore they may not feel any political pressure to weigh in. I don't know if that's true. That's just a theoretical possibility, but I haven't heard much from them lately.
The domestic politics issue of that may force their hand, don't you think?
It's very limited. Domestic politics. Okay. I'm going to tell a joke, one of my jokes, and I shouldn't do that because this is on the record. So when I talk to congressional staff about nuclear weapons programs, the first thing I do is I tell them exactly where all our nuclear weapons facilities and capacities are, what states they're in. And staffers pretty quickly figure out why I'm telling them that, because then they now know which members it's a constituency issue. And so I run through the states where we have deployed ballistic missiles, deployed bombers, and I end with, and then there's the great state of New Mexico, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Department of Energy. Madeline laughed at that the other day. So that is true. You know, there are domestic constituency issues on whether or not funding and programs matter to the constituencies for members interacting with the labs and the lab directors in California and New Mexico. It's just not enough to turn the tide.
Well, please join me in thanking Amy for a great conversation.